In our last unit of the year, we're going to be taking a look at inequalities. And an inequality is simply an unequal relationship. Hopefully you are familiar with at least 4 of these symbols: greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and this last symbol is simply not equal to. But we're going to be focusing on the first 4 relationships in this unit. We're going to start with a little investigation into what happens when you perform operations on an inequality. So we're going to start with an inequality that we know is true. -2 is less than 4. And first we're just going to add and subtract the same amount to both sides of the inequality and see what happens. So we're going to start by adding 2 to both sides of our inequality. And we get 0 is less than 6, which is true. Now we're going to subtract 2 from both sides of our inequality, and we get -4 is less than 2, which is still true. So what this shows is that adding or subtracting a positive amount to an inequality keeps it a true statement. Well, let's see if we get the same thing when we add or subtract a negative. If we add -2 to both sides of our inequality, we get -4 is less than 2. Hopefully you recognize this statement. We just saw it a minute ago when we subtracted. Because remember, adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting. So we got another true statement. So now we are going to subtract -2 from both sides. And we get, remember, subtracting rule is add the opposite. So we get 0 is less than 6, which we saw a minute ago when we added, because subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding. So when we add or subtract, whether it's a positive value or a negative value, if we add or subtract the same amount to both sides of an inequality, it remains a true statement. This is important when we go to solve inequalities, that we keep track of our operations as we're solving. So now we're going to see what happens when we multiply and divide both sides of the inequality by a positive or a negative. So I'm going to start with my same true inequality, and I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. I get -2 is less than 8. Sorry, -4. I wrote the right number. -4 is less than 8, which is true. And if we divide both sides by 2, we get -1 is less than 2, which is still true. So far it seems that we can do anything as long as we do it to both sides of the inequality, and it's still true. Well, we have one more relationship to look at, and that's multiplying and dividing by a negative. So if I take -2 less than 4, and I multiply both sides by -2, I get 4 is less than -8. Well, 4 is not less than -8. 4 is greater than -8, so we have a false statement. Let's see what happens when we divide. -2 less than 4, and if we divide both sides by a negative, we get 1 is less than -2. Again, 1 is not less than -2, that is false. So the important rule to keep in mind when you are solving inequalities, if you multiply or divide by a negative, you need to flip the inequality symbol in order to keep it a true statement. So we'll see some practice with that when we get into solving.